Okay, today we have a really diverse set of topics we're going to talk about under the innovations in transportation. I think people can read very quickly. Gil Penalosa is going to give us a brief talk at the beginning. We're going to then go to Carol Sims, Director of Environmental Affairs for Alaska Airlines. So we're going to actually finally move out of the electric grid a little bit and be talking transportation and even including the airlines. Bob King, President of Pacific Biodiesel, talking about what you would expect, biodiesel. And Murray Clay, Managing Partner at Ulupono, and I think I'm going to hold off on what he's going to talk about and let him introduce it when he gets up there. And so first is Gil.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. And I want to start by saying that here Hawaii is so beautiful that sometimes people take it for granted. And when we're talking about mobility and transportation, I have not been to all of the islands, but I've been a lot of around Honolulu. I've been now in Maui. Yesterday, took all afternoon to go and visit different neighborhoods. And one of the things that is very, very clear is that God was very, very, very generous with Hawaii in every way. But that's the good news. The bad news is that people have not been as good with Hawaii as God was. The reality is that from the point of view of mobility, you see it, and there's a lot of symptoms. Like when I was going through the neighborhoods, I saw so many neighborhoods that don't even have sidewalks. Really wide roads for their cars, and they don't even have sidewalks. As if everybody drove. They don't realize that people under 16, they don't drive. So they need sidewalks. And also many older adults, the same thing. Also, when I look at those beautiful mountains, I saw some neighborhoods, and they say, oh, they used to be sugar plantations. Yeah, but how are you allowing people to do those developments that are so far away and that are not really going to be sustainable? It doesn't matter if the cars or the public transit is electric or is hydrogen or is gas or is whatever. You cannot continue sprawling like that, otherwise mobility clearly is not going to be sustainable. So we need to change, things, and obviously change is hard. Sometimes I think some of the people that have done the most to promote a different way of living and more urban living, I would say, is Friends. Have you seen the sitcom Friends? That one. Before that one, in the 80s and 90s, almost every show on TV was a house in the suburb with dad and mom and dad and two kids and two cars and the front yard and the backyard. And then all of a sudden, Friends came on board, and people, for the first time, they saw young people, good-looking, successful, living in cities, walking, taking public transit. And then following Friends was Sex and the City. Again, these good-looking women, successful, they would go to a restaurant, they fight with their boyfriend or whoever, and they walk home. Or they take a taxi, or they take public transit. And these things help to change minds in so many ways. All of a sudden, people realize that people don't need 2,500 square feet to survive. In the US, we have multiplied by 3 times the size of the houses in the last 40 years. We don't really need that more space. So how, even if you have all of the smart meters and all of this, imagine if instead of 2,500, you got 1,500. So it would even be better. Of course, we need all of that technology, but we need all of that technology also within a smart framework of the cities. And when we're talking about transportation, I think we should focus on the most vulnerable. Who are the most vulnerable? From the point of view of mobility, are the people walking, then the people using bicycles, public transit, and then the cars. From the point of view of the age, is the children, is the older adults. It's also the poor. It's also the people, the handicapped. 15% of the population are handicapped. 15. That's 1 billion people in the world. Of the people over 65, 40% have some kind of handicap. So it's probably the largest minority in the world. And actually, it's a minority that has something different than all other minorities. Because if I'm not Hispanic, I'm not going to become Hispanic halfway through my life. But if I don't have a disability, I might become disabled. Actually, 40% of the people over 65, 40%, 4 out of 10, have some kind of disability. And for example, from the point of view of older adults, we were talking yesterday that in the US, 80 years ago, it was about 1 in 50. 20 years ago, it was 1 in 10. Today, it's about 1 in 8. And within 30 years, it's going to be 1 in 4 in the US and 1 in 3. 1 out of 3 people in Hawaii is going to be an older adult. So what kind of cities are we going to have for the older adults? And if not only is 1 out of 3, but almost half of them, 40%, are going to have some kind of disability. From the point of view of transportation, do we have a proper transportation where people can walk or bike or take public transit or use their car, whether it's an electric or hydrogen or any other way? And we need to ask the citizens also. I think it's very, very critical to listen to the community. Let me give you an anecdote of public engagement. The other day I was with a community, and I was asking the community, I said, why don't you give me, how can we improve our community? Give me some impatiens and some orchids. Impatiens are these flowers that are really easy to grow, so it's low cost, low risk, and high visibility. And then the orchids are things we can do in years 2 to 5. And then all of a sudden, a woman said, oh, Gil, when I'm walking home, the sidewalk is very dark. And I say, yeah, but we're talking about impatiens. It's low cost, low risk, and high visibility. And this woman said, you know, Gil, this is low cost, low risk, high visibility. When I'm walking, the sidewalk is very dark, but the street is very well lit. And the streets don't need so much light because the cars already have lights. All I'm asking the city is for someone to go up on the ladder and have the light, turn it 90 degrees, share it with the sidewalk. It's the same post, the same light, the same cable, and all of a sudden it's going to be transformed. And when you go around Hawaii, any of the islands, any of the communities, you will see that most of the streets are very well lit and most of the sidewalks are very dark. So this anecdote, and I want to end with that anecdote, and then we'll have time to listen to others and listen to you and have comments. That anecdote teaches us that we need to hear the community. We need to listen, honestly listen to the citizens, because the citizens have many fantastic ideas. But also that many of the solutions are not really expensive. Many of them are common sense, but we need to do things in a different way. And also, finally, is that we, of course, need the technology. We can have solar energy in those lights on the street. We also can have different kinds of bulbs so that they will last longer and that they will use less energy. So the technology is very, very, very important. But this also teaches us is that it's not only about doing things right, but it's about doing the right things. Doing things right is only saying, okay, the light is on the street, we're going to put solar energy, we're going to put some bulbs that are more efficient and so on. But if the light is only on the street, it's only doing things right. If the sidewalk is still dark. But if we do all of that technology, and on top of that, we turn it 90 degrees, and we share it with the sidewalk, then we're going to be using energy in a more efficient way, and we're going to be doing things right, but also we're going to be doing the right things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gil. And as I indicated, we're going to change topics now. We're going to get, I think one of the first talks I would have heard out here in Hawaii discussing the use of alternative fuels for commercial aviation. Carol?
Thank you. We just want to thank all of the conference organizers for inviting Alaska Airlines to be here and participate in this. One of the first questions people might ask is, why Alaska Airlines here in Hawaii? So hopefully I'll be able to answer that question for you. We are based in Seattle, Washington, not in Alaska. We currently have, with our Virgin, America merger, 35 daily flights that go from the islands to the mainland, and that contributes to over 20% of our market. So we have a pretty good big footprint here in the islands, and we have some sustainable aviation fuel goals, and we think that it makes sense to look at the islands as a place where we may be able to realize those goals. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why the aviation industry in general is interested in biofuels, and then what Alaska's progress has been to date on that. So first of all, I just want to talk about, through the UN, through the International Civil Aviation Organization, the global airline industry has voluntarily agreed to reduce emissions. We recognize that right now we are about 2% of total global emissions, but airline and air traffic is targeted to grow pretty significantly between now and 2050. And we recognize that it's a responsibility of all of us to reduce emissions. So we've come up with some goals in 2009 to, starting in 2010, reduce emissions 1.5% a year to 2020, and then carbon neutral growth from 2020 to 2050. And our very strong aspirational goal is to reduce emissions by 50% by 2050 over a 2005 baseline. So how are we going to get there? So there's a 4-pillar strategy that has been articulated through ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, that we need technology improvement. So those are technologies on the aircraft, where we look at electronic flight bags, what we call required navigational performance, where we actually can shorten the routes. We can, instead of having that step down landing where you're powering up and down as you land, we can just have optimized descent, burns a lot less fuel. Part of that technology sector is the introduction of sustainable aviation biofuels in a big way. Also, how we fly, the operational improvements, infrastructure, and then we see this emissions gap where we actually are going to have to be doing some carbon offsetting between 2020 and 2035 to really get us to our goals. So there is a movement upfront to do that as well, which is going to cost the industry billions of dollars, and to offset some of that offsetting costs, we're looking at investing in aviation biofuels. So as far as, as far as Alaska Airlines in general, we recognize that we need to support the industry's goals, and we have articulated 2020 goals to reduce emissions, by 20% compared to a 2012 baseline. From our aircraft emissions, and then also to introduce a commercial supply of sustainable biofuels into one of our airports. We have not articulated a volume that we want to see, because right now there is no commercial supply available. So if we said we want 5 million gallons or 50 million gallons, there's just not a supply available at all, but we are trying to incentivize the supply. So when, on the slide up here, what you see is the what we fly, how we fly, and the fuel we use. Those just go with the technology improvements, the infrastructure, and the fuel. Oops. So before I get into the fuel in the air, I want to talk a little bit about emissions on the ground. Today we've talked a little bit about electrification of ground transportation. And there is a lot of movement front in the aviation industry to electrify ground services equipment. And we have a lot of projects that we've done to be able to do that. But one of the things that is necessary to do that is to have each airport actually to have the electrical infrastructure to be able to support charging stations. And what we found is a lot of airports that are interested in electrifying, actually, they need to add substation, they need to add to their power grid to be able to support electrification. So it's not as easy as just going and buying one-for-one replacement for a gas or a diesel piece of equipment. With that, I just want to talk about our emissions from air transportation. The industry as a whole recognizes that it will probably be at least 40 to 50 years before we get to something besides liquid aviation fuel. So there are alternate technologies for ground whether we're looking at hydrogen fuel cells or natural gas or electric, but for aviation, we are going to be dependent on liquid sources. So we are really looking at what those alternative sources are. This picture that you're seeing in front of you is from one of our flights that we did earlier this year using a 20% blend of biofuel. It was actually made from woody biomass from forest residuals, so the residuals that are left over after timber harvest. We're actually able to convert into isobutanol and then made into a transportation fuel. There we go. So we just want to take you a little bit on our biofuel journey of what we've done over the past few years. In 2010, we entered a partnership with Northwest Airlines and airports to look at what are some viable feedstocks within the area to be able to produce fuels. We determined that there is about 4 different feedstock types. Out of that came what's called the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Northwest Report. It is available online if anybody wants to look at that. In 2011, basically used cooking oil, animal fats, seed oil crops were approved for conversion to biofuel at a 50% blend. We're the first airline in the country to fly multiple scheduled flights. We did 75 flights using that, just dropped into our normal schedule. We did sign an agreement back in 2013 with Hawaii Bioenergy. Some of you may have heard of that. We had hoped to be able to have a commercial supply here in the islands. That project it's not going to come to fruition, but we are very interested in seeing something move forward in the islands to support our goals. I know that with the state's 100% renewable mandate, it makes it a little more viable, and we are talking to several groups here now about potential projects. We are a member of the FAA Center of Excellence on Aviation, Jet Fuels, and the Environment, which is a multi-university and community stakeholders trying to move forward alternative fuels as well. And then in 2016, as I mentioned, we flew 3 biofuel flights of 2 different feedstocks, 2 flights to Washington, D.C., definitely to make a point to Congress. We did lobby Congress about additional funding to be able to support additional efforts for research into this space. We also just this past year entered into an agreement with the Port of Seattle to do a long-term study on what are the infrastructure requirements to bring a significant supply of biofuel to that airport. Producing the fuel is one of the challenges, but right now, just for example, since we're on the west coast of the United States, if there's a fuel producer in Ohio and we need fuel in Seattle, there's really not good infrastructure to bring that fuel to us. So we're looking at if we brought it in via barge, via rail, via truck, where would we have to take it? The maximum blend rate right now with conventional jet is 50-50, so you still need to have blending capacity with conventional jet as well. Some of the overall just challenges of bringing this supply to market, and we are very interested in seeing this. People are always like, so do you have a commercial supply? You're flying biofuel. As I mentioned, there is no commercial supply available on the market right now. United Airlines invested in a company called Alt Air Fuels in Los Angeles, and they are making about 3 million gallons a year, so they're starting to produce a little fuels, but that's the only supply in the United States, and it's currently all spoken for, so there's not an open market to be able to buy this. So a couple things, there's 4 approved pathways. The timeline from an idea that goes before the certification body, ASTM, to reality is about a 5-year, $50 million process. There's not always feedstock availability to be able to produce fuels for multiple years. Maybe a fuel producer can produce fuel for 3 years, 8 years, 10 years, but if we're looking at contracts going forward 20 plus years, it's just not there right now. There's the blend percentage restrictions. Some types of biofuels can only be mixed at a 10% blend with conventional fuel. Some can be blended up to 50%. NASA is actually doing some work right now and actually doing flight testing to 100%, but that's probably a long ways off before it's commercially viable. Cost premiums are still very high, in some cases double what conventional jet cost, which is, although people think airlines make a ton of money, we operate at a pretty thin margin, so those costs really impact us. We need to make sure that we can actually get the fuel into a pipeline system to make it have good economics. So I think my 10 minutes are up, but I wanted to give you an overview of what we're doing, how we're trying to move this forward. We are trying to send market signals to producers to be able to enter into some agreements to move this whole thing forward.
Thank you, Carol. And now, someone a lot of people in this audience obviously know, Bob King. Give us a little bit of perspective on biofuel production and use, I think, particularly here in the state of Hawaii. Bob?
All right. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Nice to talk with everybody today. Nice to have a conference at home. Let the Oahu folks travel this time. Pacific Biodiesel was started here on Maui in 1995, so we're one of the oldest biodiesel companies in the U.S., or the oldest, I think. We had the first commercial biodiesel pump here on Maui. We built a dozen plants in different places, and now our latest and greatest plant is on the Big Island. It's on the right-hand side of the screen there. And that's a 5.5 million gallon a year plant, and it makes distilled biodiesel, which is really the highest quality biodiesel available these days. So it's also the first certified sustainable biodiesel plant by the Sustainable Biodiesel Alliance. So that's a little bit about who we are, and I'd like to talk about where biodiesel is in the state, where our fuel is going in the state right now, and what our goal would be for biodiesel's position going forward. And you know, in my mind, we're not competing with the other renewable fuels, so we're part of the mix. And as we all know, we're going to need all those fuels and all those technologies to get to our 100% renewable energy goal. So amongst all energy users in Hawaii, this is Pacific Biodiesel's where our fuel goes today. So this is just biodiesel. 5 million gallons a year is what we're currently producing, and about 77% of that goes to power generation. 15.8% goes to on-road fuel, trucks, buses, fleets. About 5% to ag, and a little bit to the military, and a little bit to air actually, so airport transits, and a little bit to marine. So this is where our current fuel is going. Where do we want to go? I think we could get to 55 million gallons of biodiesel produced in the state by 2045. Again, that's with the right incentives and desire to get there. That's based on how much land I think we would allocate to growing crops for biodiesel, and that's maybe half of the solid ag land in the state, in a rotation with other food crops. So 55 million gallons, it's an aggressive number, but I think that's absolutely doable for Hawaii, so let's allocate it. And my guess is we're going to allocate about 41% of that to on-road. So a lot more of it goes on-road. Only 23% to power generation, and 5.5% to ag, and marine is a big piece, 20%. So that would be where I would see biodiesel amongst everything. Today we're on a transportation panel though, so let's take away the non-transportation parts of this. which is the power generation and just go back to where it goes and where it's going to go in the transportation sector. So in the transportation sector only, we're doing about 1.5 million gallons today. Most of it's going on road, but we have some in marine and some in for the military. And where would that go in the future? You can see a lot more of it's going to on-road than to off-road in the future. So 39 million gallons would be my take on it, and 59% of that goes to on-road. The marine, by the way, covers all of the marine. That's 100% of the fuel that Young Brothers would use to put inter-island transportation to run the tugs. If you want more for power generation, or you want more for on-road, you have to take it from somebody else. So it'll be a little trade-off of where do you want this fuel to go. The nice thing about biodiesel, it goes everywhere. We know we can do everything with it, but let's use all the other sources for everything that we can use it for, and that's how we get to a 100% renewable energy future. And I feel very good about being able to come through with the portion that we're the biodiesel portion of this picture. So what are the hurdles? And the hurdles really have to do at this point with funding. The technology is there. We're already doing it. So there's no technological hurdle to overcome. We know we can do it. We do have to grow crops in Hawaii, so I guess that's technology, but it's really more like getting out there and getting it done. Got to put plants in the ground. And the commitment is really the biggest thing. So are we going to be committed to do this or not? And that's what the industry, and that's what the funders are looking for. Is this really, can we really put down the kind of money we need to build the infrastructure to do this or not? So we've had good success and bad, and some not so good. City and County of Honolulu has been on biodiesel for 13 years. No problem. None of the other counties have got on board. We've got fleets that are on it successfully, others that won't try it. So there's some commitment of where are we going. We're not all going the same way right now. So in order to make those long-term infrastructure commitments, we're going to have to. The industry is going to have to feel like we actually are all going the same direction. The opportunity, I think, is spectacular. It's just, it's there. This is all, it's here, we can do it, and it's fuel plus food. When we grow crops for biodiesel, we're also growing meal that can be cattle feed. We're going to rotate crops that are actual primary food crops. This is going to get farmers back on the land doing diversified agriculture. So fuel, food, feed, face as in cosmetic oils. It's a big part of the value picture. To get the fuels at the right price, we have to get the high value products like the petroleum company makes solvents and things. We're going to make some high value pieces that help buy down the cost of fuel. Fiber, and all these are turning into family wage jobs here in Hawaii. So that's $7 billion we're sending out of the state right now. That's a serious amount of good paying jobs. And when you're doing farming, it's labor. So most of that money is going to go to families, to people working the land. So that's our vision. That's where we want to go. That's our sunflower field, and my wife, who is not here today. We're having a little get-together on Earth Day, April 22nd, at the sunflower field, and if you're around, you're invited to come. Look forward to growing more on Maui. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. And I finally got to see your sunflower seed field, even if it was a picture. Impressive. So we're going to change topics rather significantly here. Murray Clay is going to talk about a topic that I think is dear to many people's hearts here in Hawaii, and it has to deal with rail and public transit. So, Murray?
Aloha. The Ulupono Initiative, together with the Oahu Economic Development Board, conducted a public-private partnership viability assessment for the Honolulu Rail Project. Now, you might wonder, why am I talking about Honolulu Rail Project at the Maui Economic Development, or the Maui Energy Conference? And the two main reasons. One is that clearly, as I think we all understand, it's the largest infrastructure project in the state, transportation, or really of any kind for that matter. On top of that, the public-private partnership benefits that I'll talk about apply to really any major transportation or other infrastructure project in the state, so we should keep that in mind. But it's helpful to first recognize what the study is not. So it is not a funding study. It was not a study to try to figure out how we can magically find that $2 billion budget gap that is still out there. What it was meant to do is really just inform stakeholders of the benefits of public-private partnerships and what that could do for the rail project. Now, we've always been interested because transportation is the biggest use of energy. It's bigger than electricity in terms of the energy pie in Hawaii. We've always been interested in the rail project, but that interest level was risen to the level of a crisis last fall when the FTA mandated a new financial plan that would close that nearly $2 billion budget gap or risk losing $1.55 billion of federal support, of which we've already spent $712 million. So we decided to get involved and see if we could help out with this public-private partnership study. We engaged Jones Lang LaSalle to do the study, as they had extensive experience in the area, and we wanted them to look at these alternative finance and delivery structures within P3s that could help the project. Now, since the first three sections of the rail project are already under contract, the focus of the study was really on the last section. That's section 4. That's the city center guideways and stations. That's what the CCGS is. That's the 8 stations across those last 4 miles that take it all the way to Ala Moana, as well as the Pearl Highlands Transit Center. So it only applies to those two pieces. Those two pieces together, including contingency, are $1.63 billion. Now, on the table in the upper right-hand corner, you can see reasons why we thought P3 might be able to help. This is from an extensive database of UK P3 projects. And we had to use the UK because they've got a centralized database. In the United States, with 50 separate states, we really don't have the same kind of database on P3 projects. But if you look at that table, P3 projects, 80% of them were on budget, as compared to purely government-built ones, 17%. P3 projects were on time or on schedule 66% of the time, whereas the government-built ones were on schedule 30%. And on top of that, the P3 projects had average cost savings of 17% below what the publicly built equivalent was. Okay, so I think we know what the project is, 21 stations across 20 miles. Voters originally supported this really because I think we wanted to decrease traffic congestion. According to the Texas A&M Urban Mobility Scorecard report, it tracks 471 different urban areas. Honolulu is ranked number 53 in terms of population, but number 3 in terms of stress index. And stress index is just the ratio of your peak rush hour commute time to free flow time. So if your peak rush hour commute is twice as long, that's a stress index of 2. So if our population is 53, but our stress index is 3, that means that we're far worse off than our population would suggest when it comes to congestion in Honolulu. We also wanted to have affordable public transportation. It's important to note this project was meant to be subsidized from the very start. It was never meant to pay for itself because they wanted to keep it inexpensive enough that anyone could use it. We also wanted to enable transit-oriented development. Now, according to the Honolulu TOD study, proper transit-oriented development where you increase the urban density around that rail line and you create these walkable, bikeable communities around the rail line, you can do two things. You can save a lot of land, a lot of open space, about 7,000 acres of ag land or open space, and you can reduce between now and 2050 a cumulative $7.2 billion of road spending. And on top of that, we wanted to support the state's renewable energy goal of getting to 100% by 2045. And as has been mentioned previously, for electricity, we're doing pretty well. We're off to a pretty good start. We're far greater than 20% renewable on electricity, but we're far less than 1% renewable when it comes to transportation. I think we're all familiar also with the history of the project in terms of the cost overruns and the delays. The delays seem to come from 3 main sources: lawsuits, contract disputes, and gaps in funding. The project has been funded on a pay-as-you-go system where you get some money from the GET surcharge, and then you stop until you get some more, and you kind of go like that. Whenever there's a gap, you got to kind of pause. But those three types of delays happened at the absolute worst possible time because during the same period of time, construction inflation reached a peak. In fact, we were #1 in the nation in 2014 for construction inflation, and we had 14% a year inflation. It's come down quite a bit since then, but it's still up there. That's partially because of, obviously, the building in Kaka'ako as well as rail combined. Now, on top of that, there was the cost of unexpected utility relocations, which we've heard about in the news as well. Moving those things turns out to be pretty expensive. Okay, so what exactly is a public-private partnership? The term is thrown around a lot. Sometimes it's misused, but essentially it's the stuff on that chart that's the red stuff in the middle. So on one end, you've got traditional delivery, which is just the design build or design bid build, just the kind of general contracting. On the far other side, it's privatization, where you're just selling the asset to a private company. It's everything in between where the public and the private entities are cooperating. And it just makes some sense that the government is good at, or supposed to be good at, ensuring and protecting the public interest, whereas the private party, being a company that's always reporting the bottom line, is supposed to hit their projects on time and on budget. So you let each side do what they're good at, and you just seem to get better results. And the case studies that the Jones Lang LaSalle folks looked at really bore that out. With the case studies they examined across a wide variety of transit projects, it looked like 15 to 25% average savings from the P3 projects compared to their publicly built comparables. There's often a full life cycle focus that goes out to O&M as well, operations and maintenance, and the payment to the partner, the private partner, is often based on output and performance. So if you screw up, you delay, you break it, that's on you as the private partner. Many of those risks that we're dealing with now can be shifted to the private partner. Not all of them, but many of them. Okay, so I'll just hit these two real quick. Two commuter rail line public-private partnerships case studies out of the many that they looked at. So the Evergreen Line in Vancouver, Canada, was a design, build, finance. So in Honolulu right now, we're doing the design build, which is sort of the general contracting, where the company that designs it also builds it, as the name implies. Design, build, finance means they also finance it, and you don't pay for it until it's completed. No more money out the door until the project is complete. So the Evergreen Line was the extension of the existing SkyTrain system, which was kind of like our system, driverless, automated, and elevated. So there's a lot of similarities there, and they saw 15 to 16% cost savings when they went to a design, build, finance structure. The Eagle 3 project in Denver is about twice as long as ours. It's 40 miles versus our 20. Ironically, they started the same time we did, and theirs is done in an operation. I visited it a couple months ago. It's beautiful. But they came in with a design, build, finance, operate, maintain. That's what the acronym means. So they included the O&M to get the whole life cycle covered in one contract. And because they bundled everything up, they got 27% savings versus the budget they had from just doing it publicly, which they originally were looking at doing. So big savings from using the P3. But what can it do for the Honolulu Rail Line? Let's jump forward. Okay. It can reduce costs, as I've just implied by the case studies. It can transfer risk to private parties. It can accelerate delivery. Oftentimes, the job gets done faster because when you do a design, build, finance, the private party doesn't get paid until they deliver the project. So any delays or disputes hurts them as well, and so they want to get it done quickly. They have every incentive to get it done quickly. And the fact that there's no delays from funding shortfalls is because you're not, again, paying until it's complete. That's a pretty big benefit. There still are some challenges. The project, despite the benefits of P3, still is absolutely dependent on public funding. There's no free money out there. There's no magic bullet. The project is midstream. The first three have already been contracted, so you can only kind of look at that last segment. And there could be some potential challenges to a change in procurement from design build to design build finance, but it is definitely doable. The project was designed from the very start to have small stations. They wanted to minimize the amount of real estate they bought for those stations. So the small stations, unfortunately, also mean small monetization and commercialization opportunities, such as advertising, parking, and concessions. Smaller stations, smaller monetization. And unfortunately, in the state of Hawaii, we have very limited local P3 track record. We haven't done really much of this. And in fact, there's 34 states in the union that have P3 enabling legislation. Hawaii is not one of them. That's probably something we need to work on. So the Jones Lang LaSalle folks also did a value for money assessment. They did both a qualitative and a quantitative assessment, both looking at case studies, running Monte Carlos, using some equations that the Federal Highway Administration uses to figure out what the savings could really be. And they looked at 4 scenarios with 5, 10, 15, and 20% discounts off the capital costs based on P3 efficiencies, similar to the case studies. And when they kind of bundled it all up and looked at the life cycle costs, it was like a 6 to 16% total savings looked like the reasonable range. May not sound like a huge percentage, but on $2 billion, it's a few shekels. Okay, so a few conclusions. First, the good news. The design, build, finance structure can address cash flow constraints, defer payments until the project is completed. I don't know about you, but as a taxpayer, I'd much rather start paying for something when I can actually use it. So that would be kind of a big benefit. It's most likely enabled under existing legislation. I talked about how having enabling legislation would be helpful. That's true. Design, build, finance is one of the categories, if you will, of P3 that you can do without enabling legislation. So we could do it right now if we wanted to. It does not conflict with any of our existing contracts, could accelerate the delivery timeline potentially, and you could have those 6 to 15 or 16% savings. Well, the bad news, I've already alluded to some of this, is P3 is not, as some people seem to think, free money. It just doesn't bring free money in. Public funding is still needed for that $2 billion budget gap. We did not take in the study, because the study, again, was not a funding study, a firm position on where that money should come from. That's more a political decision at the end of the day. But because speed is of the essence, because delays cost a lot of money, it does seem like extending an existing mechanism like the GET would be the fastest option, but at the end of the day, it's a political decision, and that's not for us to figure out. But it is important to note that even though the construction inflation has come down quite a bit, it's more like 4% now versus the 14% it was before. If you add on the administrative costs and so forth of delaying a project, 1 year of delay is estimated to cost about 5.7% additional to the project, which is $114 million for each year of additional delay. But you don't have a year. We've got basically a month before that FTA deadline at the end of April is upon us. And with $1.55 billion at stake, it's probably not a good time to take our time deciding how to do this. So the bottom line is that P3 does seem to be able to deliver projects based on a host of case studies internationally and in the United States to deliver it with less risk, less cost, potentially faster, but we absolutely still need public funding to get the job done. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray. Let me encourage the audience to submit some questions. We got a couple, but it would be good to get a few more in here. You know, I'm gonna ask one. We got a vision. You know, started with a vision. Heard about some technological solutions to certain parts of the transportation, and then kind of went to something that is under development and looked for how to modify it. And I think one of the questions I'd like to come back to each of you, if you look at where you are and what you're doing, and obviously the issues and solutions are very different in areas, what do you see as really a necessary step in the near term to continue to move this forward? A lot of you identified issues, and I'm trying to get a little more concrete here. You know, how do we actually take this ball now and keep it moving or change the way we're doing stuff to really address the issues that are brought up? And if any of you have thoughts along those lines, each in your different area, understand.
Okay, I think that first we need to have a shared vision of how do we want to live. Because I think that if we have a shared vision of how do we want to live, then a lot of the decisions are simple. Like if we want our children to walk to school, then we need to have small schools where the catchment area is small, and then they're going to walk to school. If we have gigantic schools, the catchment area is going to be much bigger, and then they're not going to be able to walk to school. If we want to spend $1 out of $4 on mobility, then it's fine if everybody has a car. If we want people to be able to spend, instead of 25 or 30% on mobility, to spend 5%, then we're going to need to invest in public transit, in biking, and walking. For example, I like the idea of the public transit, whether it's a P3 or any other way, public transit is important. But we need to keep in mind that we need to develop a network of public transit, because you cannot have and also the city needs to be walkable or bikeable, because you can have the best public transit system in the world, but it's not going to pick you up in front of your house and drop you off in your place of destination. So the whole experience has to be good when you leave your house and you're going to take public transit. Also, we don't want people driving to the train, because then there's not going to be almost any savings. The biggest cost of the car is not to move it. That's very small cost of the car. 75% of the car of the cost is without moving it. If you go to the American Automobile Association, to the AAA, you will see that the cost of a small car is $8,500 a year. And most of the cost is depreciation. You buy the car at $30,000, you sell it 3 years later for $15,000. So you ended up paying $5,000 per year only in depreciation, the cost of insurance and so on. So actually, the gasoline and the maintenance and so on is a small part. So if we are going to expect that people are going to drive to public transit, then people are not going to be saving a lot of money. So in addition of building the public transit, the idea of having nodes of transit development nearby is really important, but also having local transit as the feeders. So you have the main lines, but you also got to have. And finally, I think that in the short term, we got to decide how do we want, in Hawaii, we need to realize that walking is by far the most important mode on any city, is walkability, because every single trip begins and ends by walking. So, and also we need to walk to places. So we have developments where there is nothing to shop. So where are people going to walk to? There's not even a place to walk for the children to walk and get an ice cream or so on. So this is some things, but there's many things that are totally, a lot of this is totally doable. Like deciding that in Honolulu or in Maui, okay, you're not going to have any more people being killed on the streets, whether they are walking or cycling or in cars or in public transit. It's a decision. You make that decision, and there are many actions, specific actions. You go to Vision Zero Network, and they are doing a lot of things. In Seattle, last year, Seattle lowered the speed in 2,400 miles of residential areas to 20 miles an hour. So there are cities in North America that are doing. Why did they lower the speed to 20 miles? Because it's going to be a lot safer. More people are going to be walking, because when you walk and the cars are going by at 40 or 50, it's not an enjoyable walk. When the cars are going at 40, it is. Also, because if you get hit by the car at 20 miles, there's only 5% probability of being killed. At 40 miles, it's 85% probability of being killed. So it's not a technical thing. I think so there's a lot of political decisions that could be made that could have impact in the short term.
If I could just follow up a little bit, and Gil, and maybe a short answer. You know, that vision, I mean, when I look at things that happen frequently, at the high level, it's very easy to get agreement that it's a good vision. It sounds like in some of your examples where you were in Bogota, it sounds like you had a significant influence in being able to make some of those decisions. What's the first steps that people can take to start moving in that direction? Is this a top-down, or is this a bottom-up, or is it just information getting out to the community? How do you get mobilized, to use that term again, to take the initial steps to go in this direction?
I think work on the benefits. I think the key element is not if you want walkability or if you want public transit or how are you going to move around. It's not about transportation. It's about the benefits. So focus on the benefits. Economic development, for example. The reality is that today, the best people can live anywhere in the world. So how is Hawaii? How are you going to attract, how are you going to retain the best people? However you define best, the best people in energy, the best medical doctors, the best pizza makers, the best of anything, by having quality of life. Quality of life today is the most important tool of economic development. So it's the benefit from public health. You got a big problem of public health, not only the obesity, but also in the lower income, it goes over 40%. So how to improve that public health, how to improve the issues of depression, of anxiety. So I would say it's working on those top down and also bottom up, and also developing broad alliances. Get the Board of Education involved in transportation discussions. Get the people from public health involved. This is not just an issue of the DOT. No, it's an issue that you got to get the business community, and you have to get public health and environment and economic development and you need a broad alliance to make decisions about these topics.
So Bob, moving to you. You talked about issues of funding and that, I think, people have a good idea. Technology, not so bad. And you talk commitment, and it kind of, this is aligned a little bit when I was asking what needed to be that next step. One of the questions that's come up is how many acres do you need for your 55 million gallons of biofuels? So I guess part of the, kind of combining questions, if you need this commitment, how are you going to get that commitment, and what kind of a size are we looking at? And I guess part of the question is can that be done on one island? Is it multiple islands? Is it a statewide effort? Where do we go?
Okay, I'll start with the land requirement. Absolutely, it should be statewide. Because if you do more of it on one island, then you have to ship it to another island, and now we're causing more transportation. So, as Gil says, start by getting rid of transportation and grow it on the island that it's being used on, if possible, as much as possible. It's early. There's some innovation to go in different, and it depends on what crops and what co-products and things. But I'm going to say somewhere in the 180,000 acres of land will grow the 55 million gallons of biodiesel, and that's about half of the ag land that has been identified. And there's a lot of different reports, but 440,000 acres is what is typically listed as ag land. So some of those lands will be growing sunflower, and some will be growing, pongamia, or there's different kinds of crops that are going to be grown, and that's the exciting and the innovation that we get from here to there. But before we get to, we also need a lot of infrastructure. We need, we need a whole the crushing mills, the combines, the tractors, the storage. These are all pieces that we don't have today, and to make those commitments, substantial commitments, we've got to know that the states that we're doing what the state wants us to be doing, and the worst thing for this industry, which is what has been going on for 20 years that I've been in it, is everything is on and off. Federal incentives are 2 years and they're gone. Maybe they come back and maybe they don't. So the states that have done well moving biodiesel forward are the states that have mandates for volumes, because that lets everybody compete on it, make it any way you want, but be assured that you're talking 5% this year, 10% this year in our mix, and then we ratchet it up to 100%. And we need to know those commitments are real, and they have to be bankable. In other words, can't have an out that, with this legislature it's in, next one it's out. Those don't work with financing. So we need to know that we're making these investments in the correct manner. Now there's a few more, but I'll stop there. Thank you. Did I answer that part? Or,
Yeah.
I can keep going, but
Can I just add on?
Sir, absolutely, please.
I just want to add on just an aviation biofuels perspective, and it's probably clear from this discussion, but maybe not, is that the biofuels that Bob's talking about is not what we can upload into an aircraft. They're a very different fuel type. For jet fuels, it has to have enough energy density that it's going to fly you from here to the mainland and not drop out of the sky halfway across. It also has to be able to reignite if you have a flame out of an engine. So there's a lot of different fuel properties. Just want to make sure that when people are looking at, well, if we have these volumes here, can we just upload those in the aircraft? And the answer is no. However, there is an effort afoot to try to take renewable diesel, so sort of more second generation biodiesels, we call it green diesels, and be able to actually use that as a low percentage blend stock with jet fuel, kerosene, still be able to meet the fuel energy density and requirements for jet fuel. And there is a huge market. There's about 1 billion gallons globally already being made. So if we could use that fuel to blend it, it really helps aviation lower our carbon footprint. But to go to Bob's statement about growing on the different islands, is that aviation biofuels, we're looking at the same thing, is that there's no silver bullet. There's multiple types of feedstocks that can be used. They can be grown in different parts of the country, and that transportation of the feedstock, if you're going to try to take the feedstock across the country to then refine it, is going to just blow your economics. So we have to have small-scale facilities kind of placed all over the country and distributed.
Carol, a question that came up that's a little bit different. You showed some of the work to transition the ground transportation equipment. In terms of moving toward your goals, what fraction of your emissions are attributed to ground equipment? Maybe what they originally were, where they are now, or how much can that be a contributor to your goals?
Ground transportation and transition is great for improving local air quality issues. When we look at doing our greenhouse gas survey, 99.4% of our emissions are from aircraft. So where do we want to spend our money? Where are we looking for is actually trying to reduce emissions. But we do know that there is some bang for the buck. There are a lot of, through DOE clean energy programs. I don't know how much money Hawaii's getting, but from the VW consent decree, states are getting funding to be able to go to electrification. We're looking at different types of grant money. California actually has a pretty robust program to help transition some of that, but from making any kind of dent in our overall emissions, we could electrify our entire ground fleet and really not make much progress.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
But we're still doing it.
Okay, I'm going to get time for a few more questions, and this one, Murray, in very interesting work and results. What are your plans for, kind of along the line of what are people doing? What are your plans for next steps, or what do you think should be done with where you are now with that information, and are you engaged in trying to do that?
Yes, thank you. So there's two answers to that. The first one is specific to the rail project. Well, actually, I'll combine them. So in terms of order of importance, the first thing to do is clearly to close that $2 billion funding gap, because if that doesn't happen, P3, nothing else can save you. It's not going to work. So you got to close that gap somehow by the end of April, or again, you lose the FTA money, and then the $2 billion gap becomes a $3.5 billion gap, and then it's probably game over at that point. So you got to close that funding gap, number one. Number two is to seriously consider going from design build, what they're doing now, to design build finance. It's not very difficult. I realize that it might be uncomfortable to those who haven't done it before, which is why you hire an advisor that has done this many times before. It's kind of like when a company wants to go public, they hire an investment bank and they take them public. You work with an advisor, they take you through the process, they've done it before. It's not really that difficult to get it going. So if you go with a design build finance process, then either that person can do it, or you can hire a specialist firm to start looking now at those commercialization and monetization opportunities. Even though they're small because the rail stations are small, advertising alone could be, call it $30 or $40 million potentially a year if it was done really well. So that's something that can contribute towards the O&M, which needs to be paid for. So we've all been talking about capital expenses, not the operations and maintenance. And in America, we tend to build these really expensive projects, and then we kind of hurt over that money that we spent, and we save money by deferring maintenance, and those wonderful projects break down quickly. So you need to pay for the O&M as well, and getting someone on the commercialization and monetization is an important part of that. The last thing is something that applies to everything, not just rail, and that's to really get that P3 enabling legislation in place. 34 states, like I said, have it. We do not. The good news is it's very easy. It's not very state specific. I'm not a policy expert, but you could basically almost cut and paste it out of a state that has that law and put it into a bill and get it done. It's not very hard to do. And whether you like Trump or not, he's made it clear that a lot of these big infrastructure projects going forward are going to be P3. And so why would you want to cut yourself off from federal funding? It's something that we ought to have in place.
Okay, thank you. This one's a little bit, I won't Bob, maybe your direction again a little bit, and I won't ask the question quite the way it was asked. I'll ask it that way, but then give you an option to answer differently. And maybe you do want to answer. Do you support House Bill 1580 to set a 100% clean transportation fuel? And I think I'd actually like to change that question a little bit and say, is that really the legislation that gets you where you need to go, or is there something? I mean, you kind of talked about commitment of the state. Are there other things that near term or long term would be helpful?
Okay, well, I think, yeah, everything helps. And I actually haven't got into the details of 1580. I should have, but it's I believe it's got a long-term goal, but it doesn't have a next year goal. So those are the pieces that I think are necessary, is to, rather than saying we're going to be 100% renewable transportation in 2045 and then have no, basically bankable pieces in between, we have to have, well, let's step it along the way. And it also gives us a good place to adjust if needed. Why are we not at least 5% or 10% in diesel today? Many states are. Minnesota's talking about going 20% biodiesel mandate for the state next year. And that's a cold place. We got really optimum conditions for using it. So what it tells investors is that that it's out there somewhere, but it's not time to do the projects yet. To get to to get to our goals, we need to be doing things now. We can't wait till the last minute. You can't put this all together in a couple of years. It'll be like trying to build rail in a year. It's going to take time. So let's get started. Let's get the first pieces. Let's start learning our lessons and making our mistakes. And back to that, if I could kind of take a little sideline on that, again, when I was talking 180,000 acres, I also, one of the points that's great about biodiesel is that there's a lot of pieces to this. This is not just acres committed to fuel. Making 180,000 acres or 55 million gallons of biodiesel is going to make 220,000 tons a year of high protein meal for the cattle industry. That brings back 75% of our cattle production back to the state. It's a big deal. So and the food component and farmers on the land that are going to be growing tomatoes and everything else in between. So it's a part of a holistic agriculture economy, diversified agriculture economy coming back into the state. And that's the great thing about how fun it is to push one piece and bring all the other benefits on board with it.
Okay, we have just about 2 minutes left, and this is, all of you think about transportation, think about urban development. There's a lot of people who, don't live near the zones. They don't live in town. Just kind of in short, what's your vision for what their situation will be? How will people get from where they are now? Is it all urban development? Is it different transportation? Just a couple of minutes or a couple seconds each on what do you see as this transition path for people who aren't moving into the new urban development areas?
Well, I think that the reality is that people are moving into urban areas. In Hawaii, 91% of the people live in urban areas. And the trend is going to continue moving in that direction. And the reality is that if we want to improve transportation and land use are just two sides of the same coin. And we also got engaged, like today, the US Congress is talking about healthcare. There is no healthcare in the world, whether it is Obamacare or Trump care, that is going to survive if it's only curative. It has to be preventive. And there is no better way to be preventive than being physically active as a normal part of everyday life, and that's walking, that's taking public transit. And so it's this kind of elements. So I think Hawaii has a magnificent opportunity, but has to realize, because Maui is going to grow by 40% in the next 25 years. So how are you going to do that 40%? You got a magic wand. How do you want to grow that 40%? Even the best part of Maui, you could do it even better. So it's such a great opportunity to use it. And I know that change is hard, doing more of the same is easy, but I think that we need to realize that the way we're going is not sustainable and it's not going to be resilient.
If anybody has anything else they have to say, otherwise we're out of time. And that was a great closing comment. Gil, thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank the panel and thank the audience.